a grandmother executed by firing squad, a grandfather who died screaming in a labor camp, and one Soviet engineer who decided that revenge was worth more than his life. What you're about to hear isn't just a spy story. It's the most expensive act of vengeance in Cold War history. A single man who cost the Soviet Union billions of dollars and changed the outcome of the arms race forever. You're watching Spies of War. Here we tell real spy stories, operations, betrayals, and quiet choices that changed lives. If you'd like to go deeper into this world with me, you can subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. It quietly helps this channel grow and shapes which stories I cover next. January 1978. A gray Moscow afternoon at a gas station near the American embassy. A thin man with thick brown hair and ash-colored eyes approached a car with diplomatic plates. His hand trembled as he pushed a crumpled envelope through the half-open window. "I have information," he whispered in Russian. Important information about Soviet military systems. The CIA officer inside looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, then pushed the envelope back. "We're not interested." The thin man stood there, watching the car drive away, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. But this wasn't the first time Adolf Tolkachev had tried to reach the Americans. And it wouldn't be the last. Because when a man has nothing left to lose except his hatred, he doesn't give up. He becomes something far more dangerous. He becomes patient. Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev wasn't born a traitor. He was born in Aktyubinsk, Kazakhstan in 1927, just 10 years after the Bolshevik Revolution that promised equality and delivered terror. His childhood was ordinary for Soviet standards. Cramped apartments, rationed food, the constant background hum of propaganda telling you how lucky you were to live in the workers' paradise. But it was his wife's family that taught him the real price of paradise. Natalia, everyone called her Natasha, was the daughter of victims. Her mother was arrested in 1937 during the Great Terror, accused of being an enemy of the people. Executed by firing squad before her family could visit. Natasha's father died in a Siberian labor camp. Starvation, cold, despair. Natasha was a child when the state destroyed her family. When she married Adolf Tolkachev, she brought that destruction like a dowry made of grief and rage. The young couple learned how to survive in a system that murdered people they loved. Smile at the right times. Attend the right meetings. Never say what you really thought, except in whispers, late at night, behind closed doors. Their 9th-floor apartment near the American embassy became a sanctuary for forbidden thoughts. Natasha made tea while Adolf paced the small kitchen, speaking in low tones about silenced writers, Solzhenitsyn, Sakharov. And slowly, Adolf Tolkachev made a decision. If the Soviet state could take everything from innocent people, then he would take something from the state. Have you ever hated something so deeply that it became a part of you? Not the hot, explosive hatred that burns out quickly, but the cold, calculating kind that lives in your chest like a second heartbeat. That's what Tolkachev carried. Every morning when he walked into his job at the secret radar design bureau called Phasotron, that hatred walked with him. By the mid-1970s, Tolkachev had become exactly what the Soviet system wanted, on the surface. Chief designer at Phasotron, one of the USSR's most classified facilities. He had access to MiG-29 blueprints, Su-27 specifications, missile guidance systems that NATO couldn't counter. He knew where Soviet radar could see. More importantly, he knew where it couldn't. And he wanted to give all of it to the Americans. But approaching the CIA in Moscow was like breaking into a prison from outside while guards watched every move. The KGB tracked foreign diplomats constantly. Anyone who approached an American was assumed to be either an informant or bait. Tolkachev knew this. His first attempts were desperation wrapped in calculation. He started watching embassy cars, memorizing routes, standing at bus stops with his heart hammering, waiting for the right moment. And then, one afternoon in late 1977, he made his move. The gas station was chosen carefully, public enough for a brief encounter, quiet enough for 30 seconds unnoticed. He'd rehearsed the words for weeks, wrote them down, burned the paper, wrote them again. When the diplomatic car pulled up, Tolkachev's hands were numb, not from Moscow winter, from pure fear. He approached, pushed the envelope through the half-open window. Inside, a handwritten note in Russian. I am a Soviet engineer with access to classified military radar systems. I wish to provide this information to the United States. This is not a provocation. I am willing to prove my authenticity. If you've ever taken a risk that could destroy your entire life in a single moment, a risk where turning back was impossible the second you moved forward, then you know the exact terror that Tolkachev felt watching that envelope disappear into the car. The CIA officer inside read the note quickly. His training screamed at him, "This is a trap." The KGB is famous for these provocations. They dangle fake sources to identify CIA officers, to compromise operations, to spread disinformation. Every instinct told him to refuse. He pushed the envelope back through the window. We're not interested. Tolkachev stood frozen as the car drove away. The envelope lay on the ground like a failed bomb. He picked it up, stuffed it into his coat, and walked away. But Tolkachev wasn't deterred. The rejection crystallized his resolve. He tried again 3 weeks later. Different station, different car, same result. Third time, fourth, fifth. Each time, CIA officers followed training. Assume it's a trap, drive away, report it. And each time, Tolkachev went home to his 9th-floor apartment and felt the hatred burning hotter. By early 1978, CIA headquarters had 5 reports of a persistent Soviet trying to make contact. Someone in the Soviet division finally asked, "What if he's real?" The debate inside CIA was fierce. Moscow was the world's most dangerous city for intelligence operations. The KGB's counterintelligence network was legendary. Hundreds of watchers, cameras in streetlights, informants everywhere. One CIA officer called it trying to breathe underwater. But the potential intelligence was too valuable to ignore. Soviet air defense was a black box. If this man was real, if he truly had MiG-29 specs, S-300 details, missile guidance systems, it could shift the balance of power. They decided to take the risk. In spring 1978, CIA officer John Gilsher was assigned to Moscow Station with one mission: find that engineer and assess if he's genuine. Gilsher spoke fluent Russian and understood the delicate psychology of recruitment. He started driving routes where previous contacts occurred, making himself visible but not obvious. And he waited. It took 3 weeks. A rainy April evening near a metro station. Gilsher sat in his car when a figure in a dark coat appeared beside the passenger window. Soft knock, insistent. Gilsher's hand moved toward his hidden weapon, but stopped when he saw the face. Gray eyes, crooked nose, exhausted desperation. He rolled down the window 2 inches. The man pushed through another envelope and spoke. I have been trying for 6 months. Your colleagues think I am KGB. I am not. I am a radar engineer at a classified research institute. I have information about Soviet fighter aircraft that your military needs. If you drive away, I will stop trying, and you will regret it. The cold certainty in his voice made Gilshire hesitate. "Get in," Gilshire said. The moment Tolkachev sat in that passenger seat, his life split into two versions. Either this was a CIA officer who would help him destroy the system that murdered his wife's parents, or this was a KGB trap, and he'd just signed his death warrant. "Why?" Gilshire asked. The only question that mattered. "Why are you doing this?" Tolkachev didn't talk about money or ideology. He talked about his wife's mother, executed, her father, dead in a camp, the Soviet state's infinite capacity for cruelty. "I want to cause maximum damage to this regime," Tolkachev said, his voice flat. "I want to hurt them in ways they cannot repair. Your country is their enemy. That makes you useful to me." Gilshire had recruited dozens of sources. Some wanted money, some escape, some recognition. But he'd never heard hatred distilled into such pure purpose. "What do you have access to?" Tolkachev's smile was thin and bitter. "Everything. MiG-29 and MiG-31 radar specs, Su-27 avionics, air-to-air missile guidance protocols, S-300 surface-to-air defense. I am a senior designer. If it flies and carries Soviet weapons, I have seen the blueprints." Gilshire kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. If even half of this was true, he was potentially the most valuable intelligence source in the Cold War. "We'll need proof," Gilshire said. "I brought proof." Tolkachev pulled out folded papers, technical diagrams, mathematical formulas, component specifications, clearly photocopies of classified documents. Gilshire took them carefully. This was the moment that could end his career or make intelligence history. "I'll need time to verify these." "Do it quickly. The longer I wait, the more dangerous this becomes. Next time, we'll need better security than a car on a public street." He stepped into the rain and disappeared into the metro crowd. Gilshire sat watching water stream down the windshield, then drove carefully back to the embassy, following his memorized surveillance detection route. The documents flew to Langley on the next flight. 3 days later, Air Force and Navy analysts sat in a windowless room studying the pages. Their conclusion: the information was genuine, highly classified, and represented access the U.S. had been trying to penetrate for years. Adolf Tolkachev wasn't a KGB trap. He was real, and he was offering to betray his country on a scale that defied comprehension. That night, Tolkachev returned to his apartment and made tea. Natasha watched him with worried eyes. She didn't know yet what he'd done, but she could sense the change, the way you feel a storm building before the first rain. "You look tired," she said softly. "I am tired." He looked at the cabinet above the kitchen door, where he'd built a hidden compartment years ago. Soon, that space would hold CIA equipment, microfilm cameras, emergency cache, and a cyanide capsule for the day everything went wrong. But that night, sipping tea in their Soviet apartment, Adolf Tolkachev felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The Americans had listened. They believed him. And soon he would begin the most dangerous game any man can play: stealing his country's deepest secrets while surrounded by the most effective counterintelligence service on Earth. When someone takes everything from you, what's left except the hunger to take something back? Tolkachev's revenge would cost billions and shift the Cold War. But it would also cost him everything: his freedom, his family's safety, and eventually, his life. The CIA had recruited the most valuable spy in modern history. They had no idea how devastating his intelligence would become. And they had no idea that thousands of miles away, another man was already planning to sell him out. That betrayal was 7 years away. For now, In spring 1978, Adolf Tolkachev walked into Phasotron the next morning with a smile, sat at his desk covered with classified blueprints, and began planning exactly how to photograph everything. A cyanide capsule hidden in a fake battery. A Sony Walkman smuggled through Moscow for a teenager who'd never heard the Beatles. And 21 meetings in the shadow of the KGB. Each one a coin flip between intelligence gold and a bullet in the head. This is how one man photographed enough secrets to bankrupt a superpower, while his wife begged him to stop. March 1979. Adolf Tolkachev stood in a public restroom 3 blocks from Phasotron, a miniature CIA camera hidden inside a modified pen. His hands shook as he photographed MiG-29 radar specifications, technical drawings showing exactly where Soviet air defense had blind spots. Outside the stall, footsteps echoed. Every sound felt like KGB boots. He finished the roll, flushed for cover noise, and walked out with 200 frames of classified material that would reshape the Cold War. But the photography was the easy part. The real terror came every time he had to meet his CIA handlers in a city where the secret police could deploy 500 watchers to follow a single target. And the longer he operated, the more he realized. It wasn't if he'd get caught. It was when. The first operational meeting happened late 1979. Specific street corner, specific time, specific signal. Newspaper folded a particular way. The CIA officer would glance, and if safe, they'd make contact. Tolkachev arrived 15 minutes early, his heart hammering. He watched every face, every car, looking for surveillance patterns. The KGB's 7th Directorate could make 100 people look like random traffic while tracking your every movement. At exactly 7:47 p.m., a man in a dark coat walked past. American shoes, Soviet shoes had a distinctive cheap look Westerners couldn't fake. The man glanced at his newspaper, kept walking. 30 seconds later, he circled back. "Excuse me," the American said in accented Russian. "Do you know where Gorky Street is?" Recognition phrase. Tolkachev was supposed to answer. 2 blocks that way, past the pharmacy. Instead, he snapped, Yes, 2 blocks pharmacy. Can we walk, please? Standing still is dangerous." The CIA officer, David Rolfe, later wrote that Tolkachev was impatient, nervous, and operating under extreme stress. But he was carrying over 150 pages of photographed documents from Phasotron's most classified projects. They walked 20 minutes, constantly turning corners, Tolkachev talking rapidly about what he'd brought. S-300 specifications, MiG-29 radar limitations, electronic countermeasures. Each piece worth millions in saved research. Imagine walking through a city where every stranger might be reporting you to the secret police, where every step could be the one that leads to your arrest, your torture, your execution. That's what every meeting felt like for Tolkachev. A controlled fall toward death, hoping the ground never arrives. Rolfe explained the payment system. Foreign bank account. Tolkachev could access it if he escaped to the West. "I don't want to escape," Tolkachev said flatly. "I want to stay here and cause damage. The money doesn't matter. What matters is hurting them." Then his voice changed, almost tentative. "There is something I'd like, though. For my son." Oleg was 16, growing up in gray Soviet Moscow. American kids listened to Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd. Oleg's world was state-approved music and propaganda. Tolkachev wanted to give his son a window beyond the Iron Curtain. "A Sony Walkman," he told Rolfe, "and Western music cassettes, Beatles, Rolling Stones, whatever young people listen to in America. My son should know there's more to life than this." The request was so ordinary, so paternally tender, it contrasted starkly with the treason they were discussing. Rolf agreed. Next meeting. Walkman, batteries, and music that could get Oleg expelled if discovered. Over the next 6 years, those meetings would become a deadly routine. 21 face-to-face encounters in total. Parks, street corners, metro stations. Each time, Tolkachev brought hundreds of pages of photographed documents. Each time, the CIA paid him money he barely touched. And each time, his wife Natasha grew more furious. She figured it out within months. The late nights, the nervous energy, the way Adolf constantly checked the hidden compartment above the kitchen door. One evening in 1980, she cornered him. "You're working for the Americans." Not a question. An accusation soaked in terror. Tolkachev didn't deny it. "I'm doing what should have been done when they murdered your mother." "My mother is dead," Natasha's voice cracked. "You bringing more death into this house won't bring her back." "What about Oleg? What happens to him when the KGB comes?" "How do you choose between avenging the past and protecting the future? Between the dead who demand justice and the living who need you alive?" Tolkachev couldn't reconcile these things, so he promised Natasha over and over, "Just one more meeting, then I'll stop." And every time, he was lying. The truth was, he couldn't stop. The hatred that drove him to approach the CIA hadn't diminished. It had metastasized. Every classified document he photographed felt like a small victory over the system that destroyed his family. The CIA estimated his intelligence saved American taxpayers over $1 billion. But for Tolkachev, the money was never the point. The damage was the point. In 1982, Phasotron instituted new security protocols. An internal audit had discovered minor irregularities. Nothing pointed to Tolkachev specifically, but the institute was interviewing anyone who'd accessed certain materials. Tolkachev went to work knowing he might not come home. He took the cyanide capsule the CIA had given him, a small pill hidden inside a hollowed battery, and slipped it into his pocket. If they arrested him, he'd bite down. 3 seconds of pain, then nothing. Better than Lubyanka interrogation? The interview was conducted by a bored KGB lieutenant who asked routine questions. Tolkachev answered calmly, his hand in his pocket, fingers touching the capsule. "Do you know why we're conducting these interviews, Comrade Tolkachev?" "Security protocols. Standard procedure." "Exactly." The lieutenant made a note. "You're dismissed." Tolkachev walked out into the bathroom and vomited. His hand still touched the capsule. He'd come within one suspicious question of biting down. In that moment, standing over the toilet, Adolf Tolkachev understood with perfect clarity that he was eventually going to die for what he was doing. He went back to work and photographed 14 more documents that week. The close call should have made him cautious. Instead, it made him reckless. He took bigger risks, photographing during work hours, storing equipment in his office drawer. CIA handlers warned him to slow down, but Tolkachev was racing against time. By 1984, he'd provided comprehensive intelligence on nearly every major Soviet air defense system. The Pentagon knew where MiG-31 interceptors were vulnerable. They knew how to jam S-300 radar. They knew flight profiles that would let American bombers penetrate Soviet airspace undetected. At CIA headquarters, they called him the billion-dollar spy. His intelligence had rendered obsolete over $1 billion worth of Soviet military research. Some analysts thought the figure was closer to $2 billion. But in Moscow, the man behind that intelligence was unraveling. Security reviews at Phasotron were getting more frequent. The KGB was clearly looking for something. Tolkachev started having panic attacks, sudden moments where he couldn't breathe, where his vision tunneled. One weekend in spring 1984, he and Natasha drove to their dacha outside Moscow. While she was in the garden, Tolkachev burned everything: CIA equipment, unexposed film, his notes, foreign currency, thousands of dollars worth of espionage tools turned to ash. On the drive back, he threw pieces of burned metal out the car window: a modified camera lens, parts of a concealment device, evidence scattered across kilometers of rural road. When fear catches up to courage, what do you do with the evidence of your bravery? Tolkachev chose survival in that moment, but only for a moment. Because by the time they reached Moscow, he was already planning what to photograph next. The addiction to revenge was stronger than the self-preservation. That night, Natasha gave him an ultimatum. "You said you'd stop. You promised me 100 times. This has to end, Adolf. For Oleg's sake, if not for mine." Tolkachev looked at his wife, the woman whose mother had been murdered by the state, whose father had died in a camp. And he lied to her again. "You're right. It's over. I'm done." 2 weeks later, he was back in contact with the CIA. The breaks between meetings had been getting longer because both sides were nervous. Tolkachev had missed several scheduled encounters, leading handlers to fear he'd been arrested or had used the cyanide capsule. But he always came back, always had more documents. In May 1985, they arranged their final meeting. Neither side knew it would be the last. Tolkachev brought another package: satellite defense specs, updated MiG-31 radar parameters, internal Soviet assessments. The CIA officer handed over payment in the next meeting signal. They shook hands briefly. The American disappeared into the Moscow night. Tolkachev walked home feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a hollow sense that the game was approaching its end. What neither Tolkachev nor his handlers knew was that thousands of miles away, the spy ring was already compromised. Not by KGB counterintelligence, not by surveillance, but by greed. Edward Lee Howard had been a CIA officer training for Moscow when he was fired for drug use. Bitter, he defected in September 1985, carrying identities of several CIA sources, including details about a valuable source inside Soviet military research. And Aldrich Ames, senior CIA counterintelligence officer, had been selling secrets to the KGB since 1985. For hundreds of thousands of dollars that he used to buy a Jaguar and a $500,000 house. Among the files he sold was information about CIA operations in Moscow. The KGB was patient. They didn't immediately arrest everyone. That would expose their moles. Instead, they watched, planned, waited for the perfect moment. For Tolkachev, that moment came June 9th, 1985. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend at the dacha. Tolkachev and Natasha had been fighting less. Oleg was doing well in school, still secretly listening to his Beatles cassettes. For a brief moment, sitting on the porch watching the countryside, Tolkachev felt something approaching peace. Maybe he could stop. Maybe he'd done enough. Perhaps it was time to keep his promise to Natasha and walk away. We tell ourselves we can always stop, that the dangerous game has one more round before we walk away forever. But sometimes fate has already written the ending. Monday morning, June 9th, they packed the car to return to Moscow. Tolkachev was driving, Natasha beside him. The countryside roads were empty. They were about 40 kilometers outside the city when they saw the checkpoint. Not unusual. Soviet roads had random police checks. Tolkachev slowed down, rehearsing his cover story. The officer who approached wasn't regular police. He was KGB, and his first words made Tolkachev's blood turn to ice. "Comrade Tolkachev, Please step out of the vehicle, slowly. Keep your hands where we can see them. Behind the first officer, more men. Plain clothes, professionally positioned. This wasn't a random stop. This was a planned interception. Natasha's hand found his on the gear shift. Her fingers shook. Adolf? Her voice was barely a whisper. He looked at her, and everything he'd wanted to say for 6 years died in his throat. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop. Your mother deserved revenge. Our son deserves a future. The KGB officer opened the driver's door. Now, comrade, don't make this difficult. Adolf Tolkachev stepped out onto a rural road 40 kilometers from Moscow and felt the handcuffs close around his wrists. The billion-dollar spy's 7-year war against the Soviet Union was over. But the real price, the human cost of his revenge, was only beginning. In Washington, CIA analysts were still processing his latest intelligence, unaware their source had just been arrested. In Moscow, Lubyanka prison was preparing a cell, and in a cottage outside the city, a Sony Walkman sat on a teenager's desk, Beatles cassettes scattered nearby, waiting for an owner who would soon learn his father was a traitor. A wife sentenced to 3 years for the crime of staying silent. A son who learned his father was a traitor from a prison guard's cruel joke. And one bullet fired at dawn in a basement chamber that ended the most expensive act of revenge in Cold War history. This is what happens when the cost of justice becomes higher than the crime itself. June 1985. Lubyanka Prison, Moscow. Adolf Tolkachev sat in a windowless cell 6 floors below street level, listening to footsteps approach and fade. 3 weeks of interrogation. 3 weeks of watching KGB officers lay out photographs of every dead drop, every meeting, every classified document. They knew everything. The only question was whether they'd execute him quickly or make an example of his destruction. But what terrified Tolkachev more than his own death was a question the interrogators kept asking. Who else knew? Did your wife know? Did your son help? Because the Soviet system didn't just punish traitors, it punished their families. The interrogation room was brutal, as Soviet legend promised. Bare concrete, metal table, lights that never turned off. The KGB colonel across from Tolkachev was methodical, patient, terrifying in his calmness. We know about the 21 CIA meetings, the equipment, the intelligence you stole, MiG-29 specifications, S-300 radar, satellite defense systems. The colonel slid a photograph across the table. Even the Walkman you gave your son. Tolkachev said nothing. The evidence was overwhelming. Someone inside the CIA had sold him out. His 7-year war had ended exactly how he'd always known it would. In a Lubyanka cell, waiting for a bullet. The colonel leaned forward. Tell me about your wife. Natalia. Did she know? This was the question Tolkachev had been dreading. Yes, Natasha had known, had begged him to stop. But she hadn't participated, hadn't helped. She knew nothing. Tolkachev lied. I kept everything from her. The colonel smiled, not kindly. We'll determine her innocence. And your son, Oleg, 16 years old. Did you recruit him too? If you've ever tried to protect someone you love by taking all the blame onto yourself, knowing that the people judging you don't care about truth or justice, only punishment, then you understand the helplessness Tolkachev felt in that moment. Every word could doom his family. Silence would doom them too. My son knows nothing. He's a child. He listens to music and goes to school. He has no idea what I did. We'll see. The colonel stood. You'll be tried for treason. Article 64 of the Criminal Code. The penalty is death by firing squad. But there are ways to make your family's situation less difficult, if you cooperate fully. Over 3 months, Tolkachev told them everything. Not hoping for mercy, he knew there was none. But cooperation might spare Natasha and Oleg the worst. He described CIA tradecraft, the miniature cameras, dead drop procedures, surveillance detection routes. What he didn't tell them was why. When they asked about motivation, he said, money, greed, Western decadence. Easier than explaining that their system had murdered his wife's parents, that every document was revenge for crimes the state would never acknowledge. The KGB used his confession to roll up other CIA operations. They arrested low-level informants, expelled diplomats, closed intelligence channels that had taken years to develop. One man's hatred ended with dozens of people paying the price. October 1985. KGB officers came for Natasha. She was making breakfast. Oleg was getting ready for school. The officers were polite but clear. Natalia Tolkacheva was under arrest for failure to report knowledge of treason. But I told him to stop. Natasha screamed as they handcuffed her. I begged him. The senior officer shrugged. That is for the court to decide. Your son will be placed with relatives. Imagine being 16, standing in your kitchen, still in your school uniform, watching your mother dragged away because your father's hatred was stronger than his love. That's what Oleg experienced that morning. Oleg learned the full truth from a prison guard during a visit with his mother. The guard found it amusing. Your father sold radar specifications to the Americans for that Walkman you love so much, boy. MiG-29 data, missile guidance. He was a spy. $1,000,000 spion. $1 billion spy. Oleg didn't believe it. Couldn't. His father was a quiet engineer who came home tired, who helped with homework, who'd given him glimpses of Western culture. But then, Natasha confirmed it, her voice hollow through the prison visitor phone. He did it for my parents, for what they did to my mother and father. He wanted revenge, and now we're all paying for it. Oleg went home to an empty apartment. The KGB had confiscated everything Western, books, cassettes, the Walkman. He sat in his room that night trying to reconcile two versions of his father. The man who'd smuggled him Led Zeppelin and taught him to think beyond propaganda, and the traitor who'd condemned his family for the sake of ghosts. Which man was real? Both? Neither? Tolkachev's trial was a secret military tribunal. No press, no public. The charges, treason, espionage, aiding a foreign intelligence service. Each count carried the death penalty. His state-appointed attorney argued for leniency based on cooperation. The prosecutor's response was withering. Comrade Tolkachev provided Americans with intelligence that undermined Soviet air defense for 7 years. His cooperation does not erase the damage. It does not undo the strategic advantage he gave our enemies. Verdict: guilty on all counts. Sentence: death by firing squad. When the state decides your life is worth less than the secrets you stole, there's no appeal, no mercy to beg for. You become a lesson in what happens when individual conscience collides with national interest. Natasha's trial was shorter. 3 years in a labor camp for failure to report. She'd begged her husband to stop, but Soviet law demanded that citizens inform authorities, not criminals themselves. Her silence made her complicit. 3 years for loving the wrong man. They came for Tolkachev at dawn. 2 guards opened his cell and gestured to follow. No words. None were needed. The corridor to the execution chamber seemed longer than it physically was. Tolkachev counted his steps. 38 from cell to death. He thought about Natasha in her labor camp. About Oleg trying to build a life with a traitor's name. About his wife's mother, executed in this same building almost 50 years ago. The mathematics of revenge. His mother-in-law's murder plus 7 years of espionage equaled 1 bullet plus 3 years of Natasha's imprisonment, plus a lifetime of shame for his son. Did the equation balance? The chamber was small. Concrete walls, drain in the floor, a single chair. Tolkachev sat down calmly. The executioner checked his pistol and stepped behind him. Any last words? Tolkachev thought for a long moment. He could have said he was sorry. Could have proclaimed his patriotism or defiance. Could have sent a message to Natasha or Oleg. Instead, I only regret that I couldn't do more. The bullet entered the base of his skull at 6:47 a.m. on September 24, 1986. Adolf Georgievich Tolkachev died instantly. His body was cremated, his ashes disposed of without ceremony. No grave for his family to visit. The Soviet Union announced his execution 2 weeks later in a single paragraph buried in Pravda. Tolkachev, AG, age 59, has been executed for treason. Justice has been served. Natasha served her full 3 years. Released in 1988, she returned to a Moscow apartment that felt haunted. Neighbors avoided her. Former friends crossed the street. She was a traitor's widow, contaminated by association even though she'd begged her husband to stop. She never spoke publicly about Adolf's espionage. When journalists tried to interview her after the Soviet collapse, she refused. What is there to say? He chose revenge over his family. We paid the price. That's the whole story. She died in 2004, taking her private thoughts to the grave. Oleg somehow built a successful career despite his father's legacy. He became an engineer, like his father, though in a different field. He never spoke about Adolf publicly. When KGB archives opened after the Soviet collapse, journalists tracked him down. He declined all interviews. How do you live with a father who was simultaneously a hero to America and a traitor to his homeland? How do you reconcile the man who gave you Western music with the man who destroyed your family for vengeance? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the daily reality for children of spies who chose ideology over family. The Walkman and Beatles cassettes were never returned, presumably destroyed as evidence. But Oleg later told one friend he could still remember every word to Let It Be, a song about accepting loss and finding peace, a song his father gave him right before destroying any chance of peace for their family. From the American perspective, Adolf Tolkachev was the most valuable intelligence source in Cold War history. His intelligence saved U.S. taxpayers an estimated $1 to $2 billion. Air Force engineers developed countermeasures against Soviet air defense. Navy planners rewrote carrier operation strategies. The Pentagon knew exactly where MiG-29s were vulnerable, how to jam S-300 radar, what altitude profiles would let bombers penetrate undetected. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, American analysts studying captured Soviet equipment confirmed what Tolkachev had told them. He'd been accurate down to the smallest technical detail. The CIA inducted him posthumously into their Hall of Honor. A star on the wall at Langley. No name, just a star. But they didn't put a star for Natasha, who served 3 years for being married to him, or for Oleg, who lost his childhood. The price of intelligence is always paid by someone. Usually, it's paid by people who never agreed to the mission. Adolf Tolkachev wanted to hurt the system that destroyed his wife's family. He succeeded beyond measure. But the success tasted like ash, because the system took its revenge on his family exactly as it had on Natasha's parents. Stalin killed Natasha's mother for being an enemy of the people. The Soviet state imprisoned Natasha for failing to report a traitor. The crime was different. The mechanism was the same. The cycle of state violence consuming families didn't break. It just found new victims. Was it worth it? $1 billion in intelligence value. 7 years of strategic advantage for America. Soviet air defense compromised. And the cost? 1 execution, 3 years of prison for an innocent woman, a lifetime of shame for a teenage boy. And the knowledge that revenge doesn't heal wounds, it just creates new ones. Years after the Soviet collapse, a Russian journalist investigating Tolkachev's story found something in KGB archives. Among thousands of pages of interrogation transcripts, a plastic bag containing confiscated items from the Tolkachev apartment. Inside, a Sony Walkman and 3 cassette tapes. Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd. The technology was obsolete. The tapes probably degraded. But the journalist held that Walkman, this tiny piece of contraband that a father had requested from the CIA because he wanted his son to hear music from beyond the Iron Curtain, and realized it was the perfect symbol of Tolkachev's tragedy. He'd opened a window to the Western world for his son. And that same window let in the wind that destroyed their entire family. When you fight monsters, the question isn't whether you'll win. It's whether you'll become what you're fighting. The Soviet state destroyed families in the name of security. Tolkachev destroyed his family in the name of revenge. Different motivations, same result. The billion-dollar spy bought America an intelligence windfall. But the real price is measured in children who grow up wondering if their parents' causes were worth more than their love. In Moscow, a Walkman sits in an archive box. In Washington, a star on a wall. And somewhere between those monuments, Oleg Tolkachev lives knowing his father chose revenge over everything. That's not a spy story. That's a horror story. And the scariest part is that everyone involved believed they were doing the right thing.